Everybody, good morning. How are you all today? Not bad. All right. So we're getting towards the end of the book and of the class. I always find that sort of after 1965 or so, the book is not amazing, and it wasn't that great before, but it really sort of becomes very fast-paced. So we're going to see if we can break it down a little bit. I'm using the book structure to talk about the 1970s and early 1980s. In this time period, I think Japan goes through sort of the peak of its post-war economic growth and social change. So it's a really interesting period. But some of the sort of seeds for problems after 1989 are planted in this period too, so I want to make sure we have our eyes on those seeds as well. I also want to spend a little time talking about the situation for women in Japan that does begin to change very slowly at the end of this today's time period. So let's see if we can make sense of the 1970s in particular. The book talks about some things. I think of sort of three things that happened in 72 that really define the decade for Japan and for Japan's place in the world. We talk about shocks, right? There are certain shocks that Japan encounters. The three shocks that I want to talk about first are Okinawa, as a part of Japan, is returned in 72. This is part of the 1960 revision of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. That Okinawa will go back to Japan officially in 72, and this does happen. This is a population, right? That's again part of Japan's administrative responsibility. It's also a source of workers. It's also a source of problems, right? Japan now has to deal with all of the American military-created problems that are still in Okinawa, although there's no official control of Okinawa by the occupation. So this is a big deal, and the politicians over the next 40 years will keep talking about this issue as what they hope to fix in Japan, and it becomes sort of a big campaign promise for politicians in the post-72 era Japan. The two biggest shocks have to do with Japan and the world. The first is Nixon shock, which has sort of two components. The first component is that when Nixon is elected, Japan has been taking part in this U.S.-Japan connection, this relationship, and they've been following all the rules, and they've really embraced, right, this American protection, American cooperation, American favoritism, and so they are quite surprised when all of a sudden the U.S., which has told Japan it has to follow U.S. foreign policy, U.S. without telling Japan decides to go visit China. As you probably know, right, with the rise of the PRC and their eventual sort of the rise of the party in China, the Communist Party's takeover of China. From that point on, the U.S. does not recognize China, PRC, as China. It calls Taiwan the real China, based on the Republican government that moved there after the takeover of the Communist Party in mainland China. And so Japan follows that lead, right? And given Japan's atrocities and overall imperialism in China, this kind of, I think, makes sense. They're not able anyway to deal with with China directly. So Nixon decides to really change the script dramatically, right? By choosing to go to talk directly with Mao Zedong and to establish U.S.-China relations and open that channel without telling Japan. So this right away is a big shock. And thinking about Japan's role with the U.S., Japan had foreseen being a major economic partner, a major labor provider and exporter for the United States, knowing that China has such a bigger population, right, and that they have a very large labor force, this was a very shocking thing to happen for that reason alone. Johnny.
How was China seen in this like time period in like the U.S. and Japan? Like, were they seen as like just like another country that just so happened to be communist, or were they seen as like a major threat to like the ideals of all countries around the world?
Good question. So the 60s was a decade fraught with fear of nuclear war because the USSR was so powerful and had such a large sort of geographic and economic presence and also a human population presence. And China sort of was caught in the middle of that. So in the 60s, we see China's sort of star rising. They're more and more important in this discussion about nuclear war and about the power of countries. And part of why Nixon decides to make this switch is that he realizes that having not one but two enemies in this communist bloc is impossible for the United States. So how are they seen? They're seen as a real threat or a real possible ally, and there's a strong need to choose which one to make China.
Like, how did the world like react to Nixon being adopted? Were they like overall like happy that it's gonna like stop war, or were they overall upset with like really kind of a ruthless period?
I think he's about to die, Mao Zedong. So he's already sort of lost the ultimate control over China. There are people who are more powerful than he is in the government, I would say. So I think that this is people I think are relieved. Yeah, I would say that. I would say that this is one of those meetings that people across the world are feeling relieved by. But I feel like from 1968 or 69 or so, the world as a whole has stopped worrying about as much about nuclear war, and they're worried more about social problems in their own countries and also globally. So, there is. I think overall, this is definitely a big moment. The world is watching carefully, and lots of countries do follow suit. Right, as soon as America steps into China, many other countries decide that they would like to follow America's lead and do the same thing. So, good questions there, Johnny. And the eventual outcome is that this makes China again a global country, not just for the countries nearest to it, or those that are also communist, but for the world as a whole. And again, Japan is taken by surprise by this whole situation. To make things worse, in the same year, this is also happening in 1972, the U.S. drops the gold standard. And this is in your book. And it's, the gold standard is what fixed the price of the dollar was fixed to the gold standard. So as the price of gold rose or declined, it was fixed to the amount of $1, which was then, again, fixed to the Japanese yen. So they went up and down together with the gold standard. Again, without telling Japan, ahead of time, the U.S. Federal Reserve decided to drop the gold standard, which allows the dollar to be adjusted based upon the economic situation in the United States, but also based upon the U.S. dollar's currencies ties to other currencies. So they're also able to adjust the currency, the exchange rate, including the yen. So right away, the yen, no longer attached to the dollar, fixed to the dollar, begins to appreciate. Right, the economic growth of Japan cannot but lead eventually to some appreciation of the yen, and what this leads to the cost of Japanese goods going up overseas, while the dollar is able to stay a little bit lower. And so this does create something of a problem, but the positive part of the story is that because Japan follows the U.S.'s lead and opens trade with China as well, because they kind of have to, China becomes all of a sudden a new export recipient for Japan. And so this helps to sort of deal with this imbalance created by this rapid change from the gold standard. So there are two Nixon shocks which are happening during his early administration that I wanted to highlight. But I also want to highlight another one that's also quite important, and this is the so-called oil shock. And this is actually happening across the world. And it's quite complex, the history of sort of how all this happens. But basically what happens is Western and U.S. meddling in the Middle East leads the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries to embargo oil for the United States. So they cut off the oil supply of the United States, which, as still happens today sometimes, drives the price sometimes astronomically high for a barrel of petrol, of oil. And the fact that at this point in time, these are the largest oil reserves in the world makes this problematic. And at this point also, there's no solar or electric vehicles. This is all, cars all run on gas, right? And so this really creates a pinch that drives the economy into a bit of a tailspin. At this point, Japan is impacted by this quite a bit because they're modernized and they're still trying to have more and more of a role in industry for gasoline. They're still building up, right? In the same way that countries today sometimes are still using a lot of coal in the developing world. Japan is relying heavily, more so perhaps in the United States, on gasoline. But unlike the United States, this triggers in Japan a real panic. Like, how are we going to handle the fluctuation of the oil supply? How are we going to deal with perhaps several of these kinds of problems that are going to keep occurring? And the solution the Japanese come up with is to make better cars that use less gasoline. So across the world, the front runners in making cars that consume less gasoline from this point on are the Japanese. The U.S. finds ways through economics mostly to deal with this, but the transition towards more fuel-efficient cars comes much later. So that as we get around 1980, Japan has already gone through this crisis, begun making cars that are more fuel-efficient, and also begun to use those to take part, a large part of the global market in cars. Japan also is becoming more global on its own. So the G7 is a group established in 1975 of the seven great nations, right? And Japan is at the table. And this is the first time that Japan has been as a sort of an equal partner or an equal member of a great power group or organization. It's purely economic, the G7. And then in 85, just to give you some sort of some more information on the country's overall trajectory, the top 5 countries again get together to talk about economics, and Japan is again there. And so Japan has really arrived after lots of effort in a Western-dominated economic realm, a Western-dominated sort of global economic market. They're there at the table as well. Part of what's happening is that Japan is capitalizing on its ties in East and also Southeast Asia. One of the things that the book doesn't talk about a lot, but I think is really interesting, is that Japan was very active, right? Their empire in 42 encompassed most of Southeast Asia as well as parts of East Asia. And I showed you a map that showed Japan's empire. It was quite extensive. And then Japan lost the war, and they had to leave. But instead of just letting that sort of just walking away from all this investment, all this effort, Japan does maintain some economic as well as some technological ties to these other countries. And so in the post-war period, as Korea, as the Philippines and Indonesia are trying to themselves to decolonize and then to modernize, where do they get their information from? Like how do they build dams? How do they build bridges, right? And they call right away upon Japanese to help them with these things. So the Japanese are sort of the technological experts for Southeast Asia and most of East Asia as well, well into the 70s. And it's because of this, in part, that the countries in the Southeast Asia that were oftentimes very angry with Japan for what it did, they keep talking with Japan. They keep in conversation. They keep requesting aid and Japanese investment in this period. In '77, the Association for Southeast Asian nations is established. And this group, Japan supports this group. Japan endorses the group. Japan also tries to work with all of these groups together, these countries, to lift up Southeast Asia, kind of making good on its promises and its ambitions during colonization and imperialism, right? That these countries would be able to be independent and not controlled by the West, and would have their own governments and could economically, right, prosper. Just not without Japan being in their indirect control. Taiwan and China, Malaysia, Hong Kong, which at this point is still a separate sort of city-state, are all also going to take part, right, in this growth. And Japan's trade with these countries as well skyrockets as well. So this is one of the areas where the world wasn't really, I think, paying attention. There was not sort of a close evaluation of what was happening as Japan became the strongest economic force in Asia through these connections. Another area that's sometimes underemphasized is the official development assistance from Japan. This is Japan's Foreign Aid Office, and this office still today just dumps lots and lots of money into helping countries in the global south to develop. Countries with which Japan has no, at least obvious, economic interest. Some have seen that this is a group that this is a way for Japan to sort of try and make up for its wartime atrocities and its expansion and its immorality and these kinds of things. That I think is a little bit of a stretch. What I see in the Japanese foreign aid programs is an effort for Japan to continue to sort of foster economic connections. So, for example, in Kenya, the Japanese embassy in Kenya pulls money through the OFA into bridges and construction and dam building and well digging, all these things. But they came with contracts for companies to come do these things in Japan sometimes, in Kenya. And the same is true elsewhere in Africa. Today, China is making its name doing the same kinds of things, and people are very clearly seeing that right away the Chinese laborers and Chinese companies come in and do the work themselves. So anyway, these are all ways in which Japan becomes a global power very quickly over about 2 decades in the non-Western world. How about Korea? Korea was colonized by Japan. Korea tried to resist that, and there was suppression. Korea was also colonized in terms of identity, right, with name changes, language changing as well, having to go visit Shinto shrines on Japanese national holidays, all these things. And then after that, the U.S. and the USSR fight in Korea over Korea, resulting in the separation of South and North Korea in different countries. And Japan acts as the staging ground, right, for the U.S.'s military incursions into Korea. So in 1955, 56, 57, Japan and Korea don't talk. They just sort of stop conversating. They just can't communicate. But as we get closer to 1960, there is sort of a détente, and the Japanese and South Koreans, many of whom are interested in economic development, begin to communicate more. Other people involved here are well-educated elite men who've gone to school in the United States, from Japan and from Korea, South Korea, I should say, and who want to bring prosperity on a global scale into Korea. And if Japan is the means to do that, they're okay with that. And so in 59 and 60, the first step is Japan agrees to send back Koreans who were forcibly brought to Japan back to North Korea in particular. This is a very big step. One of the issues that Korea as a peninsula has with Japan is that they're both spying on each other. and North Koreans and Japanese are spying and sending boats, and they're also kidnapping each other. And the U.S. is obviously, they're part of this process as they're trying to thwart communism in the world. So they're funding these kinds of efforts as well. Sending back that many people to North Korea was, sort of not very strategic, right? People who hated possibly Japan and who would have interests in sharing information about Japan with North Korea. This was a really big negotiation. When this happened, it sort of, I think, led to a more open dialogue between Japan and North Korea as well as South Korea. And then there was pressure of South Korea to go ahead and just finish things up and to end these wars. Officially, the Korean War never came to an end. There's another title. There are other titles that give it the war's conclusion, but it's not actually an ended war. But the Treaty of Basic Relations that is signed in '65 does effectively make it so that South Korea and Japan can have open and pretty positive relations in terms of diplomacy. And it comes with several things, including South Korea renounces its right to ask for Japanese war reparations. So think about that for a second. Right? The country suffered a great deal, and people of South Korea, many of whom were still alive, right, and were growing up or were adults during the war, they would not agree to this, I think, very lightly. But they choose to do this because the government of South Korea promises that they're going to push for aid. And the aid comes in the form of $800 million in aid, it's all economic aid, to South Korea from Japan. So this is a lot of money all at once, and it sort of takes the place of war reparations. I think it's kind of a metaphor, right, for the switch from punishing, right, Japan to allowing Japan to be a partner and to help build up Korea in a positive way. So the aid does do that, right? When we think about South Korea today, it's very Japanized, right? And it's easy to see that as a trend that goes back to the colonial period. But a lot of that also has to do with the post-65 Korea, South Korea, that has taken so much culture as well as money from Japan and also been the site for Japanese investment. So anyway, this is a big change for Japan and South Korea. And today, South Korea and Japan are probably among the top two partners for trade with one another. But in 1990, South Korea became Japan's top trade partner. And given that China is much bigger, and given their ties to Southeast Asia or the U.S., this is a very important figure to keep in mind. Another issue that's happening is Japanese overseas are coming back as well. Japanese are coming back from the Koreas all throughout the 40s and 50s, and by that point they're done. But there's still Japanese living sometimes in hiding who were soldiers who are unable to surrender or unwilling to surrender. As far as we know, the last person to come back from overseas to Japan was in the Philippines. You can read this periodical excerpt. So the story of Sangareban, as they call him, is very well known in Japan. And when he actually came back, right, to visit Japan, And there were cameras everywhere, and he was in the paper, and it was really a big deal. So let me ask you this. If you were a Japanese person, right, and let's say you lived through the war, and you saw Sangareban return, he was 85 years old, and he was all over the papers, how would you feel about that? What would you think about this event? Johnny?
I'd be like prideful that like he listened to his orders and he never gave up even 4 years later.
Okay, all right. So that you'd have sort of a respect for him and for what he did. Yeah. Okay. Ross?
I mean, it's probably caused a lot of people to reflect on like how different their society, their government structure is pre-war, post-war.
Yeah. Right. It's sort of like a band-aid on a wound that's just sort of ripped off. Right. All of a sudden, you're thinking about this person who sacrificed so much, right, to stay and live in a different place, and lost his ties to his homeland. And he really is sort of a throwback to another time, right? He spoke Japanese that was much more formal and much, there was no slang in his Japanese. He couldn't talk very easily, in fact, with people who were trying to interview him. So it was sort of a moment also of surprise and shock, and also, yes, there was a reflection happening. Other thoughts you had about that? More hands up. Okay, so this is just one of the things that happens that continues to bring back the war into the Japanese national conscience. And this keeps happening over and over again. But this is just one I wanted to highlight for you today. Let's think about the U.S. and Japan. We kind of began today's class with that. Let's keep going with that now. Partially because the Japanese have worked so hard to make cars more fuel efficient, they quickly, over about a decade, become the top car-selling entity in the world, and the U.S. is their primary export target, and partially because the U.S. has sort of promised to keep Japan, to take care of Japan, right, and to have this connection, maintain this connection. Japan continues to export, and the U.S. doesn't stop that. In the 1970s and 80s, car exports in particular, but also things like TVs and steel and textiles from Japan also are going to continue to dominate the U.S. market. And a lot of the today's rhetoric about foreign cars, foreign materials, is from this time period when there really was this very big imbalance that in favor of Japan. And exports for things like clothing and shoes and I mentioned so like electronics and appliances from Japan were also very hot in this period because the labor in Japan was skilled and well educated often, right? But also still cheap. Japan maintains the yen at a pretty reasonable level thanks to their exports and their trade with China and Southeast Asia, and then later on with Korea. So the Americans have choices, right? They can either choose to block Japan and try and institute some brakes upon Japanese exports to the United States, or they can choose cooperation. The first part of the 80s is about cooperation, right? U.S. companies decide to bring Japanese factories to the United States, like Subaru is one of the first, but today Toyota, Honda, they all have U.S. factories as well. And then American companies go and invest in Japanese companies or directly in Japan themselves, so that they can sort of have these joint stock companies. They can have their own economic benefit from this relationship. As we get into the 84, 85, 80, the mid-80s, before the G5 happens, the United States is begging Japan to think about this issue, right? That there is this trade imbalance, that Japanese products are better and they're they're longer lasting, and they're also often more efficient than American products, and that there's no way, and they're also cheaper oftentimes. That this can't continue, and so in fear of what might happen, the Japanese voluntarily, companies as well as MITI, they decided to limit exports in key areas, especially in cars, but also in TVs and in steel and textiles, for periods of time in the United States. Sort of maintain this relationship. The G5 meet in '85, and they have they come to what are called the Plaza Accords, and these accords give the U.S. and Japan again are going to have to discuss and come to a compromise. The compromise is that the Japanese are going to make the yen stronger against the dollar, and the U.S. is not going to adjust for that relationship. And they're also going to the U.S. has asked Japan to increase demand for U.S. products in Japan. It's kind of hard to do, right? But there is an effort to try and do that, and I would say there's some success there as well. So this is how things are left. But after the G5 is over and they sign the Plaza Accords, the Japanese companies who are doing really well, like Sony, for example, they are not being very careful with what they do and how they're seen. They're making really big purchases. You know, like Sony bought Columbia Pictures. Let's see. A company in Japan bought the Rockefeller Center, so it was Japanese owned. And there are lots of these just very big golf courses that are bought in the United States by and big buildings, and they're very visible, right? And they're bought by Japanese companies. And this again adds to resentment against the Japanese for their success and for their incursion on the American market and for the imbalance between the U.S. and Japan. So one of the things that happens, partially I would say in response to popular feeling about Japan, is the Super 301 trade bill. And this is a bill that the U.S. Congress passes, which basically says that if a country is closing its doors to American products, that the U.S. can react with economic sanctions. And they use this to threaten Japan and say, you're not importing enough from the United States. And this, again, helps the Japanese decide to voluntarily limit their exports. So that's what's going on there. I want to spend about 10 minutes talking about politics now. What's happening in the background? Who are the people in charge of Japan at this time, and what are they trying to create? The first prime minister of the 70s of this period is Tanaka Kakue, he is one of these bureaucrats, right, who then become sometimes members of the top of the bureaucracy, sometimes after and then later on sometimes prime minister, so it's becoming officials who are actually elected. He has experience in the post-war period, especially in the postal system. He rises through those ranks. He also works in MITI, in Ministry of Finance. As prime minister, he is the one who takes who follows the U.S.'s lead and establishes ties with China. And then he is also a very popular figure in Japan. He's popular because he's able to build what some would call a construction state. And this is pork barreling, where he promises constituents to build things, and they say yay, and they vote for him. And he promises major corporations the contracts to build those things, and they say yay. And so the people, especially in areas that are rural Japan, and companies, they both endorse him as a person who can get things done and has their interests in mind. And he becomes very powerful for that reason. In 74, it's found that he has been, Lockheed is a company that makes airplanes, I think, and he was basically like investing in the airplane company and getting airplanes for cheap, and it was a scandal, and it was dishonest, and so for that he had to resign. But he stays, by behind the scenes as the most important political figure in Japan until I would say that, until about the mid-'80s. And they call him the Shadow Shogun for that point. So his conservative politics and his very hands-on economic management sort of, I think, continues to shape Japan's growth in the 70s and 80s, even after he's not prime minister anymore. Another prime minister of importance, a little bit later on, is Nakasone, who is he also worked in the bureaucracy in the Ministry of Science and MITI, and also Japan's SDF director. He is he's one of the chosen leaders by the Shadow Shogun, by Tanaka. So he carries on his legacy in quite I think quite clear ways. He cuts back welfare. He wants to privatize a lot of these national industries. So at this point, the telephone companies in Japan are all part of the NTT, national company, as well as the railroad, and he wants those to be privatized, and he does that, making these. First of all, they're divided up into separate companies, and then they're also competing. This is a very clear conservative or liberal conservative economic strategy, which I think actually works quite a bit. He has to resign later on because he was involved in another scandal, a company called Recruit that did real estate, had shares for sale, which he bought before they were on the market officially for cheap, and that was, again, illegal, so he has to resign, but he remains influential. Perhaps I think Nakasone's importance for me is most interesting in terms of his sort of cultural importance, what he does to the Japanese cultural scene, the sort of beyond the economics and the politics, what's happening. He again is aware of South Korea's worries and their complaints, which again are coming back into the fore. He gives them $4 billion in aid, which again they put towards development. He also convinces Emperor Hirohito to apologize to Japan's former colonies. It's not a very long apology, it's not very detailed, but they call it, the use of this term, unfortunate past, is the euphemism that the emperor agrees to use, right, to apologize for Japan's overseas transgressions. But these, I think, are sort of like drops in the bucket, right, of water that don't do a very good job of covering up for what's really happening, which is a very conservative and nationalistic rise in Japan. Nakasone himself makes personal visits, which are hard to call personal if you're prime minister, and if you go with other members of your staff to Yasukuni Shrine. He makes an official visit then in '85 as prime minister. It's announced it's in his prime minister's schedule. It's arranged by his staff. This is the first time an official a prime minister has visited Yasukuni Shrine. As you'll recall, this is the shrine that before the war, right, was the centerpiece in the capital for the sort of emperor system, right? Soldiers going to die in war. Thought about Yasukuni as where their souls would be enshrined. It was the most attended, the most frequently attended shrine in the capital. The site for lots of important imperial rites as well. So this shrine in 78 enshrined 14 Class A war criminals like General Tojo, and since that point, prime ministers had not gone officially to the shrine. They'd gone sometimes in private, sometimes in disguise, to pay homage to their ancestors, right, and those who had died in the wars before for Japan. Nakasone goes as an official prime minister, and this creates a lot of controversy. This is a picture of him at Yasukuni Shrine, and this is one of the things that South Korea is very angry about, as well as Korea, as China. I also wanted to mention in '82, he's prime minister, although he's not the one in charge of this. A textbook in Japan, textbooks have to be approved, and there are only a handful that are approved each year. And the approving body approves the textbook that has tried to sort of whitewash the history of Japan's imperialism, and China in particular. They use a lot of different words. One of the words that they use, instead of calling the 37 invasion of China invasion, they call it an incursion. But there are other things as well that make this textbook just grossly inaccurate, and it really undermines it underplays or downplays Japan's atrocities, and it leaves out lots of important details that corroborate the story of Japanese aggression. It's approved, and it's approved as one of the top 2 textbooks, and this is quite dramatic, right? Kind of erasing history, right? Trying to say, well, and people at this point in time who supported this particular textbook didn't all believe that Japan actually had committed the Nanjing massacre. They were sometimes even calling this a fabrication of the Chinese imagination. So this happens. It was really sort of a slap in the face for China and Korea, who both are very angry by this. And so tomorrow you're going to meet with Mr. Higgins to talk about this shrine and about all the fuss over this shrine. You're going to be thinking about, whether or not people, in this case prime ministers, should be able to visit a shrine that has openly enshrined those who committed war atrocities according to both Japanese and international standards, or whether they shouldn't be able to do that. So read the article. It's on, it might be on a little bit plus one JSTOR. It's easy to find. And come prepared tomorrow to talk about that. All right? Thanks.
That's interesting. In regards to the shrines, it reminds me a lot.